So I've had a special request to work through a little bit more about a PPF, a production possibility frontier, and I am happy to do that. So this is a little bonus video as you're preparing for your midterm. It's good to think about what a PPF is, what it's showing, and kind of what we can do with it. So a PPF, we start with two axes. Sounds pretty familiar, right? All of the tools we've worked with, whether it's a budget constraint, a PPF, or supply and demand curves, we start with two axes. So for both budget constraints and PPFs, what we see on the axes are two different things that we could spend money on or time on. We're thinking about ways to allocate resources. So with a PPF, I don't know, let's think about enjoyment we get out of two different leisure sort of activities. So you could play board games, and you could go fishing. Maybe float the river on a boat, cast in for some smallmouth and such. Now, if you put all of your free time into fishing, you would get this much enjoyment, utility out of fishing. If you put all your free time into board games, you'd get that much utility out of playing board games. Now, with a budget constraint, what we did was we would connect those two spots, right? With a straight line. With a PPF, that's not what we usually see. Usually we see a curved shape connecting those two. And understanding that is kind of the key to understanding the difference between a budget constraint and a PPF and why one may be useful for a particular use. So why is there this curve for a PPF? We're saying that we put all of our free time into board games and we get this much enjoyment out of it. We put all of our time into fishing and we get that much enjoyment out of it. You would think that if we split our time between the two activities, well, we would just have a line between the two, like with our budget constraint when we talked about splitting money between two different things we could buy. The reason it's curved is because we weren't talking about time spent to each one. We're talking about enjoyment we get out of. There's this element of kind of effectiveness, right? And so the curve is basically showing that we actually kind of like doing a mix of different things. And so, for example, if you put all of your free time into fishing, it means no matter what the weather, you're going out fishing. Now, even if you love fishing, give me this. There are some days when the weather is not great for going out and floating the river. So let's say we take those days when the weather is just really bad and we take them away from the fishing and we put them toward board games. When it doesn't matter what the weather's like, you're inside playing board games, right? So we take just those very worst weather days, and so we lose very little happiness from fishing because those days were crappy weather anyway, right? It's a fishing joke. So we lost very little fishing, but we gained a lot of happiness from board games because the weather didn't matter. We were sitting inside. Those are kind of nice days to be playing board games. You could think of the flip side. If we were putting all our free time to board games, that means on these gorgeous, sunny spring days after a dreary gray winter, I'm thinking back to my Michigan childhood. You can tell, right? Kentucky winters aren't that bad. Michigan winters are pretty long and gray. They're snowy too, but the gray is the worst part. And so, man, the first like nice sunny day, it's usually late March, April sometimes. But man, that is not a day that you want to be sitting inside playing board games. You gotta get outside on that first nice sunny spring day. And so, man, that is a day to go fishing, right? There are some days when the weather is gorgeous and you might as well take advantage of that. You're still spending almost all your time playing board games. You're not losing a lot of your board game enjoyment by taking the very nicest weather days and putting them towards fishing. That's why you give up very little on the board game, but you gain quite a bit on the fishing enjoyment, right? And so that's why we start really steep on either end. As we move further away from the ends, we see it gets more kind of what I'll call one for one, right? We're basically giving up an equal amount of enjoyment from board games to fishing if we're switching from one to the other. If we're over here, because we're already mixing it. We're already taking the worst weather days and putting them to board games and the nicest weather days and putting them to fishing. Here we're talking about the mediocre days, the regular days, right? And so the trade-off is more even here. That's why it's more, here the slope is about what the slope would look like if you just drew a line between the two. But we have the curve because it's not like that all the time. There is certain resources we have, in this case, weather, and how we use our time in different weather affects how much enjoyment we'll get out of these different activities. So that's why we tend to see curves on PPFs, because it's not just about how you spend your leisure time. Again, earlier we talked about like healthcare or education, right? So if we're choosing how to use our resources, there are some resources that are really well suited to education, and there are others that are really well suited to healthcare. Putting those resources toward those uses makes a lot of sense. We're not going to give up a lot of the other one. We're going to end up with a curve shape for choices like that. And that's true for most things. Of course, you could think of extreme examples and it wouldn't look like this, but generally speaking, that's what we'll see with the PPF. And so how do we think about it, work with it? Well, the most important concept after understanding the curvature of a PPF is thinking about the slope. And why is that? It's because the slope, the steepness of the curve at a given spot is showing us the opportunity cost. So a PPF, the curve shows us the opportunity cost, the slope at any given point. And so here we see the opportunity cost in terms of board games for getting this last little bit of fishing. It's really high. We get almost no extra enjoyment from fishing, but we give up a lot of enjoyment from playing board games. That's why it's so steep right there. As we move here, it's getting less steep, right? Until we're about in the middle, and it's about a one-for-one trade. Like the enjoyment from board games that we're giving up to do a little more fishing is about the enjoyment we get from that fishing that we're adding. So the opportunity cost, again, is what we're giving up to do something. And here, the slope of the PPF is showing us that opportunity cost in terms of the thing we're moving away from. We'll see that change as we go along the curve. So it matters where you are. It matters where you're starting. The other thing to think of when you're working with a PPF, this is just like a budget constraint. If you're thinking about going right here, that's infeasible, right? The curve is showing us what we can do given our current technology, given our current resources. So if you're looking at a spot outside of the PPF, we can't actually do that. If you're looking at a spot that's inside, well, we could do that. It's part of what we call an opportunity set. But we could do more. And so if you're thinking about efficiency, which I mentioned in the last video, we could get more enjoyment out of fishing without losing any enjoyment from board games by moving out here. Or we could get more enjoyment from board games without losing any happiness from fishing by moving right there. Or we could get more of both, right? So the point is, if we're inside the curve, we could move out to the curve until we're on it, doing as much as we can do, that will be efficient. That'll be getting as much as we can out of the resources and technology that we have. And we haven't talked a lot about shifting PPFs. We've talked more about shifting budget constraints, and I want you thinking about that more than this when it comes to shifts. And of course, supply and demand curves have to shift. But I've mentioned that given our resources and technology, the PPF is showing us what we can do. You could imagine what happens if technology improves. Our PPF is going to shift out some. And if it's a technological improvement that affects both axes, it's going to shift kind of out in a somewhat parallel fashion. If it affects one or the other, it would shift out in kind of a shape that pivots it a little bit. We can also think about getting more resources, and that's like with a budget constraint. If someone gives you some extra money, you have more money to spend, it shifts out your budget constraint. Same sort of idea with a PPF. If you have more resources to work with, well, that shifts your PPF out. And if your resources get cut back, then it shifts in. So if you're Western Kentucky and you're looking at your budget for the next fiscal year, you may be thinking, oh, we may have to start planning for something that looks like this if we don't get help from the federal government, because the state allocation is going to be going down, and so our PPF is going to shift in whatever these axes are, student happiness and student learning, or whatever outcomes you're looking at if you're WKU administrator, student health during a pandemic. So that's kind of thinking about working with a PPF. So there's your bonus video, so you're ready for the midterm next week. Thanks.